My name is Renee Calloway. I'm 36 years old, and for 12 years my job title inside my own family's company was, informally but very consistently, the girl at the complaints desk. Not a manager, not an analyst, not even a supervisor. Just the daughter they'd found a use for, tucked into the one department nobody else in the family wanted to sit in. 4 weeks ago, my father stood in my office. An office in a building he didn't know I owned, in a company he didn't know existed until his lawyers told him he had no choice but to find out, and asked me, with a kind of desperation I'd never once heard in his voice growing up, whether there was any version of this where I'd still help him. I want to describe what it actually looked like watching them walk into my building that day, because I've replayed it more times than I probably should admit. My father, grayer than I remembered, wearing the same kind of navy suit he wore to every ownership meeting of my childhood, looking smaller in my lobby than he'd ever looked in his own store. My mother, holding her purse the way she always did when she was nervous, glancing at the framed trade press feature on my wall, one I'd deliberately never sent home. Grant, in a suit that fit slightly worse than it used to, his easy confidence visibly cracking the moment he saw the size of the office his little sister had built without a single dollar or ounce of encouragement from anyone at that table. Before I tell you what happened in that room, if you've ever been the one in your family who got handed the smallest job and told to be grateful for it, go ahead and hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me what that job was for you. I read every single one, and I want you to know I mean it. Now let me take you back to a grocery store parking lot in Spokane, Washington, and a family business that never once thought to ask me what I actually wanted.
My grandfather, Harold Calloway, opened the first Calloway Market in 1971, a single storefront with sawdust on the floor and a butcher counter he ran himself for the first 6 years. By the time I was born, Calloway Market had grown into a chain of 22 regional grocery stores across the inland Northwest, known for a level of old-fashioned service the big national chains couldn't match. My father, Dale Calloway, took over as CEO in 1996 and spent the next 2 decades pushing the company towards something bigger: regional distribution centers, private label products, and eventual ambition to go head-to-head with the national chains on their own turf. There were 2 of us kids. My brother Grant, older by 4 years, and me. Grant was, from the time he could walk, treated as the heir to something. My father took him on distribution center tours before Grant was old enough to understand what a pallet jack was. My mother, Linda, who ran merchandising and store design, dressed him in little collared shirts for "Take Your Child to Work Day," while I got handed a coloring book and told to sit quietly near the front registers. I don't think my parents set out to build an unequal household. I think they built the household equivalent of a store layout, everything placed exactly where it made the most obvious sense to them, without much curiosity about whether the placement was actually right. Grant was loud, confident, easy to picture in a corner office. I was careful, precise, more interested in numbers than in handshakes. Somewhere along the way, careful and precise got quietly translated, in my family's internal shorthand, into not leadership material, and once that translation happened, it never got revisited. By the time I was 14, I'd built a simple tracking system, on paper first, and then in an old spreadsheet program, monitoring how often our local store ran out of popular items during weekend rushes. I found we were losing an estimated 4% of weekend revenue purely to poorly timed restocking. I brought it to my father with the kind of nervous pride you only have once in your life, before you learn better. He glanced at it for maybe 15 seconds. "That's a good little hobby, Renee," he said. "Grant's coming with me to the distribution center Saturday to look at the new routing software. You want to help your mother reorganize the produce section instead?" I want to be honest that I didn't resent produce. I resented being handed the smaller task every single time I'd just proven I could handle something bigger. There's a specific memory from that same year that explains the shape of my childhood better than almost anything else could. Our flagship Spokane store hosted an annual open house for the Regional Chamber of Commerce, a chance for my father to show off the business to other owners and prospective investors. Grant, 16 at the time, was given a laminated badge that said Future Operations and spent the afternoon shadowing my father through the aisles, shaking hands, nodding along to conversations he was clearly too young to fully follow but was already being trained to perform. I was handed an apron and asked to help refill the sample table, a job usually staffed by part-time employees. I didn't mind the work itself. What I minded was watching a family friend, a grocer from Coeur d'Alene, ask my father in front of me, "And this must be your daughter. Will she be joining the business too?" And hearing my father laugh, warmly, easily, and answer, "Oh, Renee's more the behind-the-scenes type." I was standing directly behind the sample table when he said it. Behind the scenes. As if I'd already been assigned a permanent location in every room I'd ever stand in for the rest of my life.
I didn't cry about it that day.
I refilled the cracker basket and smiled at the next guest in line, because that's what you learn to do when the alternative is making a scene at your father's open house. But I remember walking home that evening, turning the phrase over in my head, behind the scenes type, and deciding, somewhere around age 13, without fully understanding what I was deciding, that if I was always going to be assigned to the back of the room, I was at least going to understand everything that happened in it. I started reading the trade magazines my father kept stacked in his study, not because anyone assigned them to me, but because nobody had thought to take them away from me either. I taught myself the vocabulary of shrinkage rates and turn ratios and distribution lead times years before anyone in that family considered it something I might need. Nobody noticed. That was, in its own strange way, exactly the point. Here's the memory that finally taught me exactly where I stood in that family. The summer before my senior year of high school, a regional retail analytics firm in Seattle offered a competitive summer internship program, 20 spots across the whole Pacific Northwest, specifically built for students interested in supply chain and merchandising analytics. I applied on my own, without telling my parents, because by then I'd learned that telling them about an opportunity before it was secured only gave them time to quietly redirect it toward Grant. I got in. Out of several hundred applicants, I was one of 20. I remember standing at our mailbox reading the acceptance letter twice, letting myself, for a few hours, actually believe I'd done something undeniable. I brought the letter to dinner that night. My father read it, and for one brief moment, I thought I saw something like pride cross his face. Then my mother mentioned, almost as an aside, that Grant had just been invited to shadow a regional VP at our biggest competitor's headquarters that same month, an informal but well-connected opportunity that had come through one of my father's old business contacts. Same weeks. Same summer. And apparently there was only enough vacation time and travel budget for one parent to accompany one child that August. "We'll figure out the Seattle thing another year," my mother said, the way you talk about postponing a dentist appointment. "This shadowing opportunity is a real chance for Grant." I sat there holding my acceptance letter and asked the only question I had left in me. Isn't the internship a real chance too? My father didn't even look up from his plate. "Grant's going to run this company one day, Renee. This isn't really the same kind of thing." I didn't go to Seattle. I wrote a short, overly apologetic decline letter to the program coordinator, the kind only a 17-year-old writes, apologizing for taking up a spot I claimed I could no longer use, as though I'd simply changed my mind on my own. Grant went to his shadowing week. He came home with a firm handshake and a business card from a competitor's VP, and my parents mentioned both, warmly, at every family gathering for the rest of that year. I never brought up another opportunity at that dinner table again. Not because I stopped having them. Because I learned to build my life somewhere they couldn't quietly take it from me. There was exactly one person who noticed what was happening, and that was my grandfather, Harold. He was in his late 70s by then, mostly retired, still coming into the original Spoken store 3 mornings a week out of habit more than necessity.
He'd been at that dinner.
He didn't argue with my father in front of the family. That wasn't his way. But 2 days later, he found me restocking shelves at the original store on a Saturday morning, and he stood next to me for a while before he said anything at all. "Your father built something real," he said eventually, "but he built it standing on a floor I laid down first." A man forgets sometimes that the floor under him was somebody else's work, and it makes him stingy about handing any of it to whoever's coming up behind him. He picked up a can of tomatoes I'd just placed and turned it so the label faced forward, an old habit of his I'd never once seen him break. I'm not going to pretend I can undo what happened with that internship. But I want you to hear this from at least one person in this family. You are not the backup plan in case Grant doesn't work out, Renee. Whatever you end up building, you build it because it's yours. not because anybody in this family finally decided to notice. I didn't fully understand what he meant at 17. It just felt, for the first time, like someone had said something true to me without also measuring me against my brother in the same sentence. He passed away the winter after I left for college. At his funeral, my father gave a long, warm eulogy about the store Harold built, the customers he knew by name for 40 years, the standard he'd set for the whole company. Nobody mentioned the conversation he'd had with me over a can of tomatoes on a Saturday morning. I never told anyone about it either. Some things you just keep as ballast, quietly, for the years you'll need them. If you've ever had one person in your family who saw you clearly while everyone else had already made up their mind, I want you to know I understand exactly what that felt like. Stay with me, because the next part is where I finally start building something of my own. I studied supply chain management and computer science at a state university 2 states away, funded through loans and 2 part-time jobs, because the family education account my parents referenced at every holiday had, I later discovered, already been substantially drawn down for Grant's MBA years before I ever needed a cent of it. I didn't learn that detail until much later. At the time, I simply assumed there wasn't enough to go around, and that I was, as always, expected to manage on my own. I graduated in 2011 and took a job at a mid-sized retail technology firm in Portland, building inventory forecasting and distribution routing software for regional grocery chains, the unglamorous back-end systems that decide how many cases of milk get delivered to a given store on a given Tuesday, and how badly a chain bleeds money when that number is wrong. It was, in an almost poetic way, precisely the work my family's business needed most and had never once let me near. I went home for Thanksgiving that year and made the mistake of describing what I actually did all day. My father's face did the thing it always did when I said something that didn't match the story he'd already written about me. Polite, a little distant, faintly amused. Inventory software, he repeated, like it was a punchline he was being generous enough to laugh at gently. Well, I suppose every industry needs its behind-the-scenes people. Grant, by then working under my father as VP of store operations, chuckled along. Should have just come work with us, Renee. We could have used someone good with spreadsheets at the complaints desk. Nobody at that table asked what my software actually did, what problem it solved, or what I understood about the grocery industry that the family business apparently didn't. They'd already decided, years earlier, exactly how big I was allowed to become, and they weren't in the habit of revising the math. I laughed along that night the way you do at Thanksgiving. But I remember driving back to Portland the next morning with a decision quietly forming that I didn't say out loud to a single person. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life proving something to people who'd already closed the file on me. I was going to build something real, quietly, somewhere they'd never think to look for it. In 2013, I left my job in Portland with about $9,000 in savings and an idea I'd been refining in notebooks for 2 years. Regional grocery chains, the exact kind my family had built their entire life around, were losing staggering amounts of money every year to a problem nobody in the industry had solved cleanly: mismatched demand forecasting between individual stores and their distribution centers. Big national chains had entire departments and proprietary systems dedicated to this. Regional players had spreadsheets, gut instinct, and a store manager's memory of last year's 4th of July rush. I built a piece of software called Harborline. At its core, it was a demand forecasting and distribution routing engine designed specifically for regional grocery chains, the exact kind of company my family ran, built to work for anyone in that world, not just them. I didn't build it with any intention of eventually using it against my family. I built it because I understood the specific, unglamorous, invisible problem better than almost anyone else in the industry, and because for the first time, nobody was going to hand the project to someone else at the dinner table before I'd finished the sentence. Those first 2 years were genuinely hard, and I want to be honest about that instead of glossing over it for the sake of a clean story. I lived in a 500-square-foot studio above a laundromat in Portland. I ran the company alone for the first 16 months, writing code during the day and cold-calling regional grocery executives at night, most of whom hung up before I finished my first sentence. My first paying client was a 14-store chain in eastern Washington whose operations director, a woman named Marisol Reyes, agreed to a 90-day trial mostly, she told me later, because I was the only vendor who'd ever asked her what actually went wrong at her stores instead of trying to sell her something before she'd finished describing the problem. Harborline grew slowly, and then it didn't. By 2016, we had 31 regional grocery clients across 4 states. By 2019, I'd built a real team, 16 people, most of them former grocery operators who'd lived the exact frustrations I was solving for a living. I moved the company into an actual office. I stopped doing interviews with trade publications because I didn't want my face or my last name drifting anywhere near Spokane. I remember the day we signed our 50th client, a 14-store chain out of Boise, and how Marisol brought a cake into the office that read, in slightly crooked frosting, 50 and counting. It was a small thing, the kind of milestone most companies mark and move past quickly. But I stood in that kitchen holding a paper plate, surrounded by people I'd hired because I believed in the same overlooked problem they'd all spent years frustrated by, and I thought, distinctly, that this was the first room I'd ever stood in where nobody had assigned me a smaller task before I'd finished proving I could handle a bigger one. Nobody in that kitchen had ever called me the behind-the-scenes type. I'd built the whole scene myself, and for once, I was standing in the middle of it instead of the back. I don't want to pretend those years were smooth once the company found its footing, either. In 2017, a much larger competitor, flush with venture funding, launched an almost identical forecasting product and started undercutting us aggressively on price to every client we were courting. We lost 5 accounts in a single quarter. I laid off the only 2 employees I'd hired at that point, both of whom had left stable jobs on the strength of promises I wasn't sure anymore I could keep. I remember sitting in that studio above the laundromat at 2 a.m, running the numbers over and over, looking for a version of the spreadsheet where we survived to the fall without missing payroll on myself. There wasn't one. I put 4 months of company expenses on a personal credit card and told myself I'd figure out how to pay it down later, the same way I'd told myself plenty of things by then. I remember calling my apartment's landlord that October, the same week, to ask about a short extension on rent, and standing in my kitchen afterward wondering, seriously for the first time in years, whether I'd made the wrong call leaving a stable job in Portland for an idea nobody outside a small circle of regional grocers seemed to believe in yet. I didn't call my parents. It didn't occur to me as an option, honestly. Not because I was too proud, but because some part of me still assumed, correctly as it turned out, that if I'd told them the company was struggling, my father would have heard it as confirmation of everything he'd already decided about me at that kitchen table with my restocking spreadsheet at 14 years old. I wasn't going to hand him that confirmation. Not then, and as it turned out, not for a long time after either. What saved the company wasn't luck. It was Marisol Reyes, my very first client, calling out of nowhere that September to ask why her weekly forecast report hadn't come through. When I told her the truth, that we were bleeding out and I genuinely didn't know if Harborline would make it to winter, she didn't hesitate. She wired us a 6-month prepayment she didn't need to spend yet, and then spent 2 weeks personally calling other regional grocery operators she knew across the Northwest, telling them, in her words, there's a company out there that actually understands what it's like to run these stores, and it deserves to still be standing next year. 4 of those calls turned into contracts before October ended. That's the only reason Harborline made it to 2018 at all. Marisol became my VP of Client Partnerships the following year, and it was her routine account audit, for years after that, that first surfaced a detail neither of us had gone looking for. She's still there today, still the person I trust most in that building, and still, occasionally, the one who reminds me that the company survived its worst year because a client believed in it before there was much evidence to justify that belief. There was a personal cost to those years, too, one I don't talk about often. I was engaged briefly in 2018 to a man named Colin who I'd been with for 3 years. He was steady and kind in most of the ways that matter, but he wanted a version of a life I couldn't give him yet. Regular dinners, weekends that weren't consumed by client emergencies, a partner who wasn't running distribution math in her head at 2 a.m. We ended things quietly, without much drama, in early 2019. I don't think either of us was wrong, exactly. I think I'd chosen, without fully admitting it to myself, to build something that needed all of me for a while, and there wasn't much room left over for anything else. My family, of course, knew none of this. As far as they were concerned, I was still doing something with computers in Portland, quietly, unremarkably, exactly the way they'd always assumed I would. I thought about my grandfather often during those years, more than I let on to anyone. The can of tomatoes he turned label forward without thinking, the sentence he said to me on a Saturday morning that I never repeated to a single soul. There were nights, running payroll numbers that didn't add up, when the only thing that kept me at the desk instead of walking away entirely was the memory of him saying I wasn't the backup plan. I didn't fully believe it back then. By the time Harborline had 16 employees and a real office, I was starting to. If you've ever built something real specifically in the space nobody expected you to succeed in, tell me about it in the comments. And if you want to know what that audit turned up, stay with me, because this is where the story actually turns. Callaway Market had spent the better part of a decade chasing an ambitious expansion. My father wanted to modernize the chain's aging distribution network and compete more directly with the national players eating into their regional market share. In 2019, Grant, by then company president after my father's partial retirement, pushed through a plan to overhaul the company's entire distribution and inventory infrastructure, financed through a significant regional bank loan and a licensing partnership with a retail technology vendor that promised to modernize their forecasting and routing systems end-to-end. That vendor was a reseller, a mid-sized integration firm that white-labeled other companies' back-end engines and repackaged them under a polished sales pitch. What Callaway Market actually signed, buried in a technical appendix nobody at the executive level apparently reviewed closely, was a multi-year sublicense to run their entire forecasting and distribution engine on top of Harborline's core platform. My platform. My company. Built by the daughter they'd spent 20 years quietly deciding not to see. I didn't know it myself for almost a year. Harborline licensed its core engine to a range of resellers and integration partners across the country, a meaningful piece of our revenue, and I wasn't personally reviewing every sublicense agreement by client name. It was Marisol who caught it in early 2022 during a routine partner account audit, and she came into my office holding a printed summary with an expression somewhere between stunned and amused. "Renee," she said, "you might want to sit down for this one." The sublicense listed the end client as Callaway Market, LLC, Spokane, Washington. I sat very still at my desk for a long time after she left. I thought about the can of tomatoes my grandfather turned label forward on a Saturday morning. I thought about the internship letter I never sent. I thought about Grant's firm handshake and his business card from a competitor's VP. And here it was, sitting quietly in a legal document nobody in my family had bothered to read past the executive summary. The empire they'd built without me now ran, invisibly, on the exact infrastructure I'd built entirely without them. I called Marisol back into my office about an hour later, once I'd had time to sit with it. "What do you want to do?" she asked, standing in my doorway, clearly braced for almost any answer. "Nothing for now," I said. "Treat it like any other account. Same service level, same support, same everything. I don't want anyone on the team handling this differently just because of a last name and a contract." She nodded slowly. "You know eventually they're going to find out who's on the other end of this." "Maybe," I said. "But that's going to happen on my timeline if it happens at all. Not because some analyst 3 levels removed from the actual relationship stumbles onto it first." That conversation set the tone for the next 2 years. Harborline's account team serviced Callaway Market exactly the way they serviced every other regional grocery client. Routine check-ins, standard support tickets, nothing elevated, nothing withheld. I made a point of never once looking at their account activity myself, the way a judge recuses from a case with a conflict of interest.
I didn't need to see it.
I already knew, better than anyone in that boardroom would for years, exactly how much their entire modernization plan depended on code I'd written myself, alone, in a 500-square-foot studio above a laundromat. I didn't do anything with that information for almost 2 years. This isn't a story about a woman quietly laying a trap and waiting for it to spring. I genuinely didn't know what I wanted to do with it. Part of me wanted to drive to Spokane and set the contract on my father's desk just to watch his face change. A larger part of me had spent enough years working through this in therapy to recognize that reaction for what it was, the same old hunger to finally be seen by people who'd already decided, a long time ago, exactly how much room I was allowed to take up. So I let it sit. I kept building Harborline. I kept the same thin, polite distance from my family that we'd maintained for years. And I told myself that if the moment ever came where that contract actually mattered, I'd decide then, calmly, what kind of person I wanted to be about it. That moment came 4 weeks ago. On a Wednesday afternoon, my assistant put through a call from a Spokane area code. I almost let it go to voicemail, out of sheer habit. Something made me answer. Renee. My father's voice, older than I remembered, thinner at the edges. It's your father. We hadn't spoken directly in almost 3 years by then. What little contact we had ran through my mother, and even that had thinned to the occasional holiday text. I let the silence sit a beat longer than was polite. Dad, I said. What's going on? I need to talk to you about the business, he said, clearly trying to hold his voice in the register he always used at ownership meetings. Calm, measured, in charge. It wasn't landing the way it used to. We're in trouble. Cash flow trouble, tangled up with a distribution technology contract Grant signed a few years back. Our bank is threatening to call the loan on the whole modernization project if we can't resolve some technology dispute in the next couple of weeks. I don't fully understand the specifics. Our lawyers found something that concerns me, though. I felt my pulse pick up, but I kept my voice level. Years of running a company teach you that the worst thing you can do in a high-stakes moment is let the other side hear you react. What does this have to do with me? I asked, already knowing the shape of the answer. There was a pause. Our attorney traced the ownership of the underlying platform we're running our whole distribution system on, a company called Harborline. He stopped, and I heard him take a breath. It turns out you own it, Renee. The whole thing runs through you. I let the silence stretch. Not for effect, but because I genuinely didn't know what to say to the man who'd handed my seat at that table to my brother before I'd finished growing up, now telling me the seat had been mine the entire time, and he simply hadn't known where to look. That's correct, I said finally. I own Harborline. My God, Renee. His voice cracked slightly, somewhere between disbelief and the very beginning of something that might have been respect, though I wasn't ready to name it yet. Why didn't you ever say anything? I almost laughed. You never asked what I actually did for a living past the first sentence, Dad. Not once in 12 years. He didn't have an answer for that. The line just hummed between us for a few seconds. We need to talk, he said, about renegotiating terms directly with you instead of through this reseller. The bank needs proof of a stable technology partnership by the end of the month, or they're pulling financing on the whole modernization project. If that happens, we lose the new distribution centers. We lose most of what Grant's built the last several years. I looked out my office window at the Portland skyline for a long moment before I answered. Send me the contract, I said. The real one, not the summary. I'll review it and we'll talk. But Dad, I want to be clear about something before you get on a plane. What's that? I'm not doing this as your daughter, finally asking for the seat you never gave me. I'm doing this as the CEO of the company your business happens to depend on. Those are two very different conversations, and I need you to know which one we're having before you walk in. He was quiet for a long moment. Understood, he said finally, and I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard directed at me since I was 14 years old, showing him a spreadsheet at the kitchen table. It sounded almost like fear. They flew down 2 days later. My father, my mother, and Grant, along with the company's general counsel, a tired man named Whitfield who'd inherited this mess from a predecessor who'd approved the original sublicense without reading the exit clauses. I chose to meet them in my own office, not a neutral hotel conference room, not a downtown law firm's polished suite. My office, in the building where 51 employees who'd built this company alongside me walked past the glass conference room on their way to lunch, glancing in at the family that had spent 30 years pretending I didn't exist in any room that mattered. Nobody said much when they first sat down. I let the silence stretch a while longer than felt entirely comfortable for anyone in that room, including me. I'd learned, negotiating with grocery operators twice my age, that whoever fills an uncomfortable silence first usually reveals how nervous they actually are. I wasn't going to be the one filling it. Renee, my mother said eventually, her voice doing its practiced warmth. This place is really something. Why didn't you ever tell us? You never asked, I said. Let's talk about why you're here. Whitfield opened his folder and slid the original sublicense agreement across the table, the one Grant had apparently signed without reading the termination clauses closely enough. I'd already reviewed my own copy the night before. Miss Calloway, he said, careful and formal, clearly under strict instructions not to assume any familiarity. The reseller's contract with your company allows them to be dropped by Harborline without cause, on relatively short notice, and Calloway Market has no equivalent protection built into its side of the sublicense. Given your bank's timeline, we're here to discuss a direct licensing relationship. Something more stable, more favorable to our side, if that's something you'd consider. I let that sit on the table a moment. Let's be precise about what actually happened here, I said. Calloway Market signed a contract with a reseller without verifying who built the technology underneath it. That wasn't my decision. I found out about the connection to my own family over a year ago through a routine internal audit, exactly the way any other client relationship gets flagged. I've had that information for a long time and I did nothing with it. I didn't cancel the contract. I didn't leak it. I didn't even mention it. I let it run exactly the way it would have run for any other client, because that's what integrity actually looks like when you have some to spare. Grant shifted in his seat. So, we're just a client to you now. After everything. I looked at him for a long moment. Grant, you got the title, the distribution center tours, and the business card from a competitor's VP for 30 years. I got the complaints desk and a coloring book. I don't think you get to sit in my building and act surprised that I built something of my own without asking anyone's permission first. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. My mother looked down at her hands. What do you want, Renee? My father asked, and for the first time in my adult life, I heard something in his voice that wasn't command. It was closer to asking. My mother spoke up before I could answer. Renee, before you say anything, I want you to know I've thought about this a lot since your father's call. About the internship. About the sample table. I told myself for years that I was protecting you from the pressure your brother carried. I think I actually believed that for a long time. Sitting here now, in this office, looking at what you built without any of our help, I'm not sure I believe it anymore. I looked at her for a long moment. It was the first time in my adult life she'd said anything close to that without me having to ask her to. I appreciate you saying that, I said. But I want to answer Dad's question directly, because I think it matters more than either of you sitting here feeling bad in the moment. I want you to understand something before we discuss a single term, I said, turning back to my father. I'm not going to punish you out of spite and let Calloway Market collapse. I built Harborline to help chains like yours run better, and pettiness isn't a business strategy one respect. But I'm also not going to sign an agreement that treats me like the daughter who should be grateful for a seat at your table. I'm the only person in this room who actually understands the system holding your company together right now. Any deal we make is going to reflect that in writing the way it should have from the beginning. We spent the next 4 hours going through it, clause by clause. I want to walk through what actually changed because I think the specifics matter more than the drama around them. First, I offered Calloway Market a direct licensing agreement with Harborline, cutting the reseller out entirely. This alone would save the company nearly 35% on its annual technology costs, since they'd been paying a middleman's markup on top of my platform's base pricing for 3 years without knowing it. Second, I required a 5-year term with standard mutual termination protections, nothing punitive, nothing designed to trap them, just the same terms any client of comparable size would receive. I wasn't interested in holding my family hostage. I was interested in a contract that finally reflected reality instead of 30 years of assumptions. Third, and this was the part that made my father go very quiet, I required that any future public materials referencing the technology partnership, press releases, investor decks, franchise materials, credit Harborline by name, not as a hidden vendor buried in an appendix, but as a named, credited partner. Why does that matter to you? My mother asked quietly. Nobody outside the industry would even understand what that means. It matters, I said, because for 20 years, this family found ways to make sure my work never had my name on it. The internship I couldn't take, the coloring book at the front registers the complaints desk. I'm not asking for an apology tour. I'm asking for my name to exist in the story of this company, in writing from now on. That's not revenge. That's just accuracy. Whitfield reviewed the terms with visible relief. They were, by any objective measure, generous. My father read through the document twice, his hand occasionally pausing over a clause, his eyes occasionally flicking up toward me like he was trying to reconcile the woman across the table with the daughter he'd filed under, not leadership material, 3 decades earlier. At one point, he set the papers down entirely and just looked around my office, the framed trade press feature on the wall of employee photos near the kitchen, the view of the Portland Hills through the window. "This is a real company," he said quietly, almost to himself. "This isn't a side project you built to spite us. This is a real company." "It's been a real company for 8 years, Dad," I said. "You just never ask." He nodded slowly, and for a moment I watched something in him actually recalibrate, not fully, not all at once, but enough that I could see the shape of it happening. "Grant," he said, turning to my brother, "did you know any of this?" "Before the lawyers found it." "No," Grant said. "I signed what the reseller put in front of me. I didn't even know the name Harborline until 3 weeks ago." My father looked back at me. "So we've been running a 9-figure modernization plan on your company's technology for 3 years, and none of us, not me, not your brother, not our own legal team, bothered to ask who actually built the thing keeping us alive." "That's about the size of it," I said. Near the end, he set the papers down and looked at me directly for the first time since they'd walked in. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not for the contract. For a lot longer than that." I didn't answer right away. I'd waited a long time to hear something close to those words, and I didn't want to hand them back cheaply just because they'd finally arrived. "I'm not going to pretend the last 12 years didn't happen because you said that in a conference room with your lawyer next to you," I said. "But I hear you, and I appreciate you saying it out loud, in front of Grant and Mom, instead of somewhere private where it would have been easier to walk back later." Grant didn't say much that day. He signed where he needed to sign. But on his way out, he lingered by my office door. "I didn't know," he said quietly, "about the internship. I always figured you just weren't interested in that side of things." "I know you believed that," I said. "That's kind of the whole problem, Grant. Nobody in this family ever asked me what I actually wanted. You just decided, and I let you because it was easier than fighting for a seat that was never really being offered." He nodded slowly, turning something over that he'd clearly never had a reason to examine before. Then he asked, almost as an afterthought, "Would you have ever told us? If Marisol hadn't found the contract during an audit, would you have just let us keep running our whole modernization plan on your platform forever and never said a word?" It was a fair question, and I owed him an honest answer. "Probably," I said. "Not out of spite. I think I liked knowing the company's future depended on the daughter you all decided didn't have one, and none of you would ever find out. That's not something I'm proud of, exactly. But it's true, and you asked." He left after that, and the door closed, and I sat alone in my office for a long time looking at the signed contract on my desk. I want to tell you honestly what the weeks after that meeting actually looked like, because it wasn't the dramatic ending you might expect. Callaway market stabilized. The direct licensing agreement gave the bank exactly the proof of a durable technology partnership it needed, and the loan restructuring closed 2 weeks later. The new distribution centers stayed open. Roughly 90 employees across those facilities kept their jobs, which I thought about more than I expected to during the negotiation. This wasn't just my family's pride on the line. It was real people's paychecks, tangled up in a mess that had nothing to do with them. I found myself thinking, in the days after the loan closed, about all the store employees who would never know how close their jobs had come to disappearing over a licensing dispute buried in an appendix nobody read. That anonymity felt right to me, honestly. This was never a story I needed told at the register or in the break room. It only ever needed to be true in the one room where it actually mattered, and it was. My mother sent a letter a few weeks later, 4 pages in careful handwriting, admitting things she'd never said out loud before, that she genuinely believed at the time she was giving me something valuable by keeping me away from the pressure Grant carried, and that it took this entire ordeal for her to understand that a soft landing you never asked for is just another way of being pushed out of the plane. She wrote about the year I was born, how a nurse had joked, half seriously, that she now had an heir and a spare, and how she'd laughed at the time and then, without ever meaning to, spent the next 2 decades quietly living inside that joke. She wrote that she'd never once, not a single time in 18 years, asked me directly what I wanted for my own life, because some part of her had already decided the answer wouldn't matter as much as Grant's answer did. She didn't ask for anything in return, not forgiveness on any particular timeline, not an invitation to anything. She ended by saying she understood if I needed distance for a long while, and that she'd rather have an honest distance than a dishonest closeness, which is, I think, the wisest sentence she's ever said to me. I appreciated that letter more than I expected to. I haven't written back yet. I'm still deciding what I want to say, and for the first time in this family's history, nobody is rushing me to decide it on their schedule instead of mine. Grant and I have spoken twice since. Careful conversations, the kind two people have when they're testing whether there's anything worth rebuilding after 30 years of one of them being handed everything and the other handed almost nothing. I don't know yet what that becomes. I'm not in a hurry to find out. The second of those 2 calls happened on a Sunday evening, unplanned, when Grant phoned just to ask a technical question about how the routing engine handled a seasonal demand spike at one of the stores. It was, on the surface, an entirely ordinary work call, the kind any 2 colleagues might have. But it was the first conversation we'd had in over a decade that wasn't shaped by who our parents had decided each of us was supposed to be. He asked good questions. I gave him honest answers. Neither of us mentioned the internship or the sample table or any of the 30 years sitting quietly underneath the call. We didn't need to. For 20 minutes, we were just 2 people who understood the same problem from different sides of it, and that, strange as it sounds, felt like more progress than the entire signed contract had. About a month after everything settled, I drove up to one of the new distribution centers, mostly out of curiosity about the operation that had nearly taken the whole company down with it. Grant walked me through it a little too fast, narrating decisions like he was still trying to prove something, until we reached the control room where a young logistics analyst had a live routing dashboard open on her monitor, one I recognized instantly because I'd built it myself. "That's the new forecasting system," she said proudly, not realizing who she was talking to. "Company just switched to a direct vendor relationship a few weeks back. Way smoother than before. Real-time routing instead of overnight batches. It's a good system," I said, and Grant, standing just behind me, let out something that was almost a laugh once we'd stepped back into the hallway. "You built the thing keeping this whole operation running," he said, and she has no idea who she was just talking to. "Let's keep it that way for now," I said. "I don't need to be a story on this floor. I just needed it to work." As for Harborline, the company kept growing. We signed 9 new regional grocery clients in the month after the Callaway market deal closed, several of them chains in the Pacific Northwest who'd heard, through industry channels, about a founder who'd quietly built the backbone of a well-known regional grocer without anyone in that family realizing it for years. I didn't chase that attention. It found me anyway, the way real work eventually does. A few days after the visit to the distribution center, I sat in on our regular Monday team meeting at Harborline, the same meeting we've run every week since it was just me and a laptop above a laundromat. 16 people had become 51 by then. We went through client updates, product roadmaps, the usual rhythm of a company that's finally found solid footing. Near the end, Marisol brought up, half as a joke, that we'd apparently just onboarded our most complicated renewal in company history, and half the room laughed without knowing the real story behind it. I let them laugh. Some things are mine to carry quietly, the way my grandfather carried his lobby full of regulars whose names he remembered for 40 years without needing anyone to hand him credit for it. I think about him often these days. About that can of tomatoes he turned label forward without even seeming to notice he was doing it, and the 17-year-old version of me, who didn't yet understand what he meant when he said, "I wasn't the backup plan." I understand it now. I built something because it was mine, not because anyone finally noticed, and it turned out that not needing their permission was the exact thing that eventually earned it. I've started in the last few weeks doing something I never expected to do, walking the aisles of our local Harborline client stores just to watch the systems work in practice, the way my grandfather used to walk his own aisles every morning out of habit rather than necessity. There's a particular satisfaction in standing in a produce section on a Tuesday afternoon, watching a delivery truck arrive at exactly the interval my own software predicted it should, knowing that somewhere behind that quiet, ordinary moment is a version of me who once got handed a coloring book instead of a seat at the table and built the table anyway. I've thought a lot about what this whole story is actually about, because it would be easy to tell it as a simple revenge story. The overlooked daughter secretly builds an empire and forces her family to grovel. That's not quite what happened, and it's not the version worth passing on. Here's what I actually learned. Being underestimated by people who are supposed to know you best doesn't have to be the wound it feels like at 17, standing at a mailbox holding an acceptance letter nobody in your family thought was worth rearranging a summer for. Sometimes it's simply the space you're given to build something entirely your own, without anyone reaching in to reshape it before it's finished. I didn't build Harbor Line to prove anything to my father. I built it because for the first time nobody in the room got to decide how big I was allowed to become. I think that's ultimately the distinction I'd want anyone in a similar position to hold on to. It's tempting, when you're the one handed the smaller job, to spend your whole life either trying to earn your way into the bigger room or burning the bigger room down out of resentment. I tried the first approach for years, quietly, at that dinner table with a spreadsheet nobody wanted to look at. It didn't work, not because the spreadsheet was wrong, but because the room had already decided what it wanted to see before I opened my mouth. The second approach, the burn-it-down instinct, is understandable, and I don't judge anyone who chooses it. But I found something quieter and, I think, more durable in simply building a different room entirely, one where the rules were mine, where competence got to speak for itself, and where nobody got to hand me the complaints desk before I'd finished proving what I could actually do. I also learned that boundaries and revenge are not the same thing, even though they look identical from the outside sometimes. I could have pulled that contract the moment Marisol showed it to me 2 years ago. I could have let Callaway Market collapse and called it justice. Instead, I waited until the moment actually mattered, and when it did, I offered my own family the exact same fair terms I'd offer any other client, plus one condition that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with finally being seen. That's not cruelty. That's a woman who spent 20 years being written out of her own story, finally putting her name back into it, in writing, where nobody could quietly erase it again. It would have been easy, honestly, to make the terms harsher than they were. Nobody in that conference room would have argued if I demanded a shorter notice period, a steeper price, some symbolic penalty tied to 30 years of being underestimated. I thought about it briefly in the days before that meeting. What stopped me wasn't forgiveness, exactly. I don't think I was there yet, and I'm still not entirely sure I am now. What stopped me was the simple fact that I've spent my whole career building a company that treats every client fairly regardless of how I feel about them personally, and I wasn't going to break that principle the one time it happened to be my own family sitting across the table. That consistency mattered more to me than the satisfaction of a harsher number would have. I told Marisol the whole arc of this story a few weeks ago, over coffee in the same office where she'd first handed me that printed contract summary. She listened without interrupting, the way she always does, and when I finished, she asked me something I hadn't fully sat with myself yet. "Do you think you'd have signed it the same way," she asked, "if your father had never said he was sorry? If he'd just read the terms, signed, and left without a word about the last 20 years? I thought about it for a long time. "Yes," I said finally. The terms weren't built around whether he apologized. They were built around what was fair, what protected my company, and what finally put my name where it belonged. The apology was nice. It wasn't the point. And I think that's the part of the story I'm proudest of. I didn't build a business for 12 years, so I could stage a dramatic confrontation where my family finally had to grovel. I built it because it was mine, and it turned out to be solid enough, real enough, that when the truth finally mattered, it simply spoke for itself. I didn't have to raise my voice once in that conference room. The contract did the talking I'd spent 20 years wishing someone would do for me. There's a version of this story where I never picked up that phone call 4 weeks ago, where I let it go to voicemail the way some small, tired part of me genuinely wanted to. I think about that version sometimes, and I don't judge it. There are years where distance is the healthiest thing you can give yourself, and if that's where you are right now listening to this, I want you to know that's a completely legitimate ending too. Not every story needs a conference room and a signature to close its loop. Sometimes the ending is simply that you stopped waiting for people who were never going to look up, and you built a life good enough that their absence stopped being the loudest thing in the room. I think about all the versions of myself that could have led to different endings. The version who wrote a bitter reply the day Marisol found that contract. The version who let it sit forever and never told anyone. The version who let the whole thing collapse out of a hurt that had been accumulating since a can of tomatoes and a sample table decades earlier. I don't think any of those versions would have been wrong exactly. Anger earned honestly is not a character flaw. But I think the version I actually chose, patient, clear-eyed, willing to be fair even to people who'd never once been fair to me, is the version I can live inside most comfortably for the rest of my life. That matters more to me now than it would have mattered at 17, standing at a mailbox, wanting so badly for someone in that house to simply notice what I'd already built. I've heard from enough people over the years, in this line of work and outside of it, that I don't think my family's particular flavor of favoritism is especially rare. Almost every family has a version of the golden child and the understudy, the one who gets handed the microphone, and the one who gets handed the apron. What I'd say to anyone standing where I stood at 17, at a mailbox, holding proof of something real that nobody in your house seems interested in celebrating, is this: that letter, that acceptance, that small, undeniable thing you built, it doesn't need their signature to count. It only ever needed yours.
Keep building.
The room will catch up eventually, or it won't, but either way, you'll have built something worth standing inside of. But for me, this time I picked up, and I'm glad I did, not because it fixed 20 years in a single afternoon, but because it gave everyone in that room, for the first time, an accurate account of who actually built what. That's all I ever really wanted, if I'm honest. Not an apology. Not a seat at somebody else's table. Just the truth, written down where nobody could quietly move it around again. Thank you for staying with me through this one. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own family, your own quiet years of building something nobody else believed in, leave a comment and let me know. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and check the description for another story I think you'll connect with just as much. One last thing before I let you go. If you're the one in your family who got handed the complaints desk or the sample table or the coloring book while somebody else got the tour of the distribution center, I want you to know that assessment was never a fact about you. It was just a story someone told before you'd had the chance to finish writing your own. You get to keep building anyway, quietly, if that's what protects you right now, loudly, when the moment finally calls for it. Either way, the ending is still yours to decide, and nobody's signature but your own has ever actually been required to make it real. Until next time, this is Renee, and I'm finally the one telling the story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.